My father has a phrase, a particular mantra I've heard my whole life, and now I'm in the unique position of being an adult and hearing this exact phrase come out of my own mouth with the same intonation and facial expression that I recognize in my father. Have any of you had an experience like this? No. My dad's refrain is this: first things first. First things first. I don't know exactly, but I think it comes in part from his study of the leadership author, Stephen Covey. Covey wrote a book called The 7 Principles of Highly Effective People. Those of you who are nodding were reading these kinds of books in the early 1990s. And it centers on sort of how do you live a principled life, how do you focus your time and energy effectively. And the follow-up book that Covey wrote was called First Things First, and it was about time management and decision-making. And to illustrate his main point, Covey describes a glass jar. The jar is filled with rocks and sand. And it is clear that if you were to pour the sand into the jar first, the pile of rocks would not fit inside the jar. However, if you arrange the rocks in first and pour the sand afterwards, everything finds its place. The metaphor, of course, is to imagine that the rocks are arranging the important things in your life, the really important things. Your emotional well-being, your physical health, your relationship with your spouse, your children, your vocation. And by that I don't mean career, but rather what you are called by this world to contribute and offer. What we might call your ministry. Maybe it's art making or innovation or service to a cause greater than yourself. The challenge, I think, for humans in general is to stay focused and committed to the rocks and not get distracted by the sand in our lives. So it is easy as a speaker or a leader to recommend this practice, and infinitely more difficult to do. Last spring, Reverend Melora Lingood, a co-minister at the Unitarian Church in Victoria, shared publicly with the Canadian Unitarian Council at the National Gathering in a piece that she gave, a very noted lecture, that she is the chosen spiritual leader of her community, and she does not have a daily spiritual practice. She doesn't sit and meditate every morning for 20 minutes. She doesn't religiously wake up and greet the day with a yoga pose or prayer or a journal entry. And she knows that doing all of this would be so helpful to her. But she hasn't made it a habit. So when I heard this, I felt so comforted. Because I don't either. There's lots of things I do, but none of them as religiously as every morning or every evening. And it has been a New Year's resolution of mine to maintain a daily meditation practice for the past 10 years. And I rarely make it past January. I have 100 excuses. It's too hard with a young child. There isn't enough time. If I lived alone, I would do it. If my husband was committed to it, I would be too. If I had started last year, it would be easy by now. And one of the most sticky places for me is this one. If I just had a room dedicated in my house only to spiritual practice, I would magically be drawn into this room every morning. Not a room that was also the guest room or just at a corner, but a whole room with a door that I could close and use for my daily practice. I thought for sure if I had this special room, it would just naturally emerge. And the truth is we have a lovely home here in North Vancouver, and there is a room that in July I set up just for spiritual practice. And I've sat there in the morning maybe 6 times since August. Total. The daily meditation practice I longed for has not emerged even when I had what I thought I needed the most to make it happen. And I have good intentions, and I'm clear even on my vision of what it would look like. But I don't think that it's happened for a few reasons. In reality, my mornings look a lot more like Alexander in the children's book. I went to sleep with gum in my mouth, and now there's gum in my hair, and when I got out of bed this morning, I tripped on a skateboard, and by mistake, I dropped my sweater in the sink while the water was running, and I could just tell. It was going to be a day in which I didn't meditate. Have you ever felt that way? I'm guilty of checking my email before I get out of bed. Too often I don't eat breakfast and run out of the house when I'm late. And the other day I was driving to work and my shoe broke. And I was already late, so then I was hobbling across the parking lot with a broken shoe, thinking this is a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad way to start my day. Hearing Reverend Melora be honest about this, I felt a little less alone. And maybe you too have had that experience of having the intention, maybe even sitting down, fully intending to meditate, to center yourself, to have that calm, open mind. And maybe you followed the same basic instructions that I received about meditation. Follow the breath. Empty your mind, be aware of body sensations. Anytime your mind starts to wander, bring it back to your breath. Do this for 10 minutes, and really a lot longer is recommended. I usually last about 15 seconds. Before I'm recognizing my lower back ache, the temperature, the sink full of dishes, and I judge myself so quickly. I go down a rabbit hole of my own making. Who thought this was a good idea? Maybe I'm just terrible, horrible, no good, very bad meditator. Maybe I'm a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad person. Maybe it's all karma from a past life. Let me be clear. If meditation works for you, awesome. Don't stop. Go for it. Maybe I can learn from you. Another one of my teachers is my mother, and she shared with me this story that I want to share with you today. In the late 1970s, my mother was living in St. Paul, Minnesota, where she grew up, and she actually was in college and had joined this sort of intentional Eastern community. They were called Ananda Marga. They followed a particular guru, and the teachings of this community, they were called Margis. And so several members of the community had been to India to learn from the Margis and were bringing back these practices, these teachings to St. Paul, Minnesota. And one of the things that they saw the monks do in India was early in the morning, before meditation practice, was to take a very cold shower. Now, the monks stressed to the eager students from the West that this was an essential part of the meditation practice, to take the cold shower beforehand. So, returning back to the States, these eager Americans set up their own community and practice, and they began taking very cold showers in the morning before meditating. And they taught others who followed them, who hadn't been to India, to do the same. And so through the dark, cold, Midwestern prairie winter, these students took cold showers and meditated. One day they heard the good news that one of the gurus was going to come and visit their community in St. Paul. And when he arrived, they were so excited to share with him and the practices they had been doing and following. And the guru was shocked that they were taking cold showers before their meditation. No, he said. The cold water is to cool your body, to prepare it for meditation, because the meditation hall is so hot and crowded and sweaty. The cold shower is made to ease and comfort your body, to make meditation a more positive experience. My mom cannot tell this story without laughing at herself and laughing at their own efforts, their own striving to do exactly what was right and might lead to enlightenment. And yet they had been so far off target. Reverend Doug Kraft has studied Buddhist meditation for the past 30 years. And he shares with Westerners often this knowledge that when we meditate, it's so common for us to get our minds full of thinking of judgments of ourselves and others. This is actually true of anything we commit to that we struggle with. Like John's story about weight loss, it's so easy for us to criticize ourselves. That almost comes without conscious thought. Doug explains that many schools of meditation keep the mind busy with a focus. Maybe it's a mantra or a koan or a prayer or an affirmation, and for some it's the breath. And for many decades, Doug said he strove to meditate this way. His singular focus was on the brushing of air as it entered and left his nostrils. And when his attention wandered for some errand, he tried to bring his mind back to the breath. The advantage, Doug says, of this type of meditation is that the body's sensations are here and now and bring us into the present. But Doug says there is something many in the West miss. The Western habits of mind is a tendency towards over-focusing and being very driven. Our culture has a high value of the kind of cognitive thinking that separates things into categories and quickly evaluates. Whereas an Eastern framework is more oriented towards openness and expansiveness, which can also happen to an extreme degree as well. So the meditation practice many of us learn from Buddhist teachers is really created for an Eastern habit of mind, where there's a seeking to create more focus. But for the Western mind, if we block out all but one thing, we may be failing to observe and embrace the wisdom that comes simply from an expansiveness or an openness in our minds and hearts. So I said to Doug, I need some serious meditation help. Break it down really easy for me. If I'm not focusing on my breath, what should I spend this time in meditation focusing on? He said, give your mind the job of talking to you like the nicest person you know. So the nicest person I know is my grandmother. She's 95 this year. And when I see her, we used to live pretty close to her in upstate New York, and we'd visit pretty regularly. And no matter how often we visit, she says the exact same thing to me every time I walk in the door. My gracious, Emily, you're looking so good. Married life must be treating you well. You are just an amazing mother, Emily. I'm so glad you came today. So the way my grandmother speaks to me might be useful, because I begin to think for a moment, maybe I'm not such a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad, whatever. Research has intersected with my personal experience in a unique way here. There is a scholar, an Indian educator, very prominent, highly recognized, Sugata Mitra. And he documents this effect that he calls the grandmother method in teaching young children in small remote villages in India biochemistry in English. His experiments are fascinating. He takes children who've never been exposed to really computers or technology or chemistry or biology or biochemistry or English, and he puts them in a room with one computer and a group of students and a simple program in English on learning biochemistry. And he doesn't provide any instruction or teaching in English. He just lets them basically play as a group with the computer program and then tests their achievements. And he noted basically a 30% increase from scoring 0 to scoring 30% simply by trying this out, higher than was anticipated for students who were studying in a completely different language. And then he put in place what he called the grandmother method. So he hired a woman to come into the classroom, and she did not know biochemistry or English, but she stood behind the students and he said, just tell them how wonderful they're doing. Express interest in what they're doing with the computer and the program. Over and over and over. Wow, how wonderful. That's so interesting. Can you show me more? This is incredible. And their scores increased by another 20%, simply by having someone standing behind them saying, wow. I think it is this modern myth somehow that change, personal change, comes from intense striving and rigid discipline, when so often appreciation and affirmation are the cornerstones to growth and evolution. This morning, I invite you to reflect for a moment on what actually nourishes you. This is the purpose of meditation, to actually bring in more love and more acceptance for who you are, right where you are, terrible and horrible and no good in all the ways you may believe you are. Last week, I put up a massage table in the designated meditation room. We've used it twice, twice as much as we used it when it was just a meditation room. Because all of what feeds us and renews us is not in this particular box that we've been handed. It is true that all things are possible with love, and if we are seeing something as impossible, it might just be that we don't quite have enough love yet to make it real. I was walking along the seawall, and I saw a family of sea otters and loons and a hummingbird. This was on Friday. A hummingbird in January. All fully alive and thriving. None of them self-criticizing. I was reminded of Ralph Waldo Emerson, our Unitarian ancestor, whose advice on what I would call spiritual growth says this: live in the sunshine, swim the sea, drink the wild air. In our time, there is this massive movement and growth in the field of self-help and self-improvement. And yet at the core are these ancient traditions. Many of the resources and teachings we have bring value. And we may need to be wary of a more contemporary teaching that says you are not good enough as you are. The wisdom of the Buddha, of Jesus and Muhammad and the Dalai Lama all name love. Love and acceptance is at the root of growth and change. One of my own teachers describes meditation as the unfolding of love for your enemies, particularly love for your enemies within. So I've let go of my New Year's resolution already. Some days I may sit and meditate. Some days I may lay on the massage table. Some days I'm going to dance to Michael Jackson in the kitchen. And that will be my meditation. And I will trust that the efforts at self-improvement are actually more effective when I relax versus when I obsess. First things first. First, the unconditional love of grandmothers. First, radical self-acceptance. First, courageous self-love. First, fierce compassion. May it be so. Amen.